I'm Andy Galloway. So first, a land acknowledgement. On behalf of Cornell University, I acknowledge that the university is located on the traditional homelands of the Guayacano, the Cayuga Nation. The Guayacano are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence in this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States. We acknowledge the painful history of Guayacano dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guayacano people, past and present, to these lands and waters. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor James Simpson, who's the Abrams Professor this semester. Another acknowledgement: the Abrams Visiting Professorship was established in 2006 by Stephen Weiss, Cornell 57, in honor of M.H. Mike Abrams, whose many monographs and long career at Cornell redefined the study of romantic poetry and poetics in general, and whose 4 decades of general editorship of the Norton Anthology redefined the teaching of English literature, as was also recognized when Mike received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama in 2014 at the age of 101. James Simpson is currently the Donald P. and Catherine B. Locker Research Professor of English at Harvard University. While beginning as a medieval scholar, focusing on 12th and 14th century poetry especially, James has written so widely on poetry, art, literary criticism, religion, and politics from the 16th century on that I cannot, though myself a mere medievalist, dwell long on his important contributions to medieval literature and culture, such as, I will nonetheless mention, the study bridging the 12th century Allen of Lea with the 14th century English poet John Gower, garnering the John Hurt Fisher Prize in the John Gower Society, his work on Chaucer, his field-defining work on Pierce Plowman, where his introduction to the B text remains fundamental, not to mention his excellent recent edition of the Chronicle of John Harding, that 15th century octogenarian chronicler, documentary plagiarist, and spy. For in addition to all that work, all of it golden for scholars of pre-1500 literature and culture, James has established a particularly important body of work featuring what might be called the genealogies of modernity, focusing especially on post-medieval iconoclasm, fundamentalism, and the rise of the category of the aesthetic, a dialectical combination that Simpson has examined in a series of wondrously lucid and, dare I say, aesthetically sensitive books. His Reform and Cultural Revolution, 1350 to 1547, 2002, which won the Sir Israel Gollancz Prize of the British Academy, first brought into focus James's distinctive approach to the shattering disruptions across that span of religious, political, and literary culture. His subsequent little book, Burning to Read, English Fundamentalism and Its Reformation Opponents, 2007, which is to my mind a perfect scholarly book in its erudite, critically sensitive, widely implicated, and blessedly short unfolding of Reformation battles over textual interpretation, traces how contextual approaches to narrative clashed with pretenses to reading texts supposedly without context, the latter helping to found a covert authoritarianism that, James argues, underwrites many modern modes of literary interpretation. His Under the Hammer, Iconoclasm in the Anglo-American Tradition, 2010, moves between 5 centuries of iconoclasm in art as well as poetry, taking up the artistic and political underpinnings and implications of what, for Simpson, is iconoclasm's inevitably endless operations. And his substantial recent study, Permanent Revolution, the Reformation and the Illiberal Roots of Liberalism, 2019, more fully establishes and extends that story. As the subtitles of more recent and forthcoming essays indicate, Professor Simpson is just getting started in elucidating historical juxtapositions and genealogies. Note, for instance, the period juxtapositions of his subtitles of 3 recent essays are forthcoming: Intention and Interpretation, Now and Then. Literary traditions, continuity and change. The once and future Canterbury Tales. All these promise, as his works increasingly have, to challenge scholars in both early and contemporary studies to engage one another's periods and reconsider the genealogies and implications of their own. Before I ask you to join me in welcoming James, I'm told I should tell you there's a reception after the talk that's upstairs in the English lounge. So please join us there. But now, please join me in welcoming Professor James Simpson, speaking today on modernity, selfhood, and the desacralization of images, or being an early modern image hurts.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for that heartening introduction. I do feel as if I'm just getting going. I've left my run a bit late, perhaps. I never met Mike Abrams, but I felt that he was a presence in my life over the last 20 years. How so? I've been a co-editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature for the last 20 years. And I swear to you that at every meeting of the collective of co-editors, the general editor of the anthology and or the Norton editors never ever fail to mention with deep affection the presence of Mike Abrams. We've all felt, we co-editors who came in 2003, we've all felt that Mike Abrams has been a kind of benign presence overlooking our efforts to refresh the anthology and overlooking our efforts with warm encouragement, approval, never with resistance or repudiation. He's been a kind of genius anthology for us as editors. In any case, I'm deeply honoured to be invited to be the Abrams lecturer, to hold the Abrams Fellowship. And I thank this wonderfully distinguished department for that invitation. Well, once I received the welcome invitation to deliver this lecture, I naturally set to pondering my topic. Various possibilities suggested themselves until one day I happened to cross this passage in a book by the philosopher Nicholas Waltersdorf. Waltersdorf is reflecting on the changes in the ways Europeans received visual art in the 18th century, and in particular on the sudden appearance of disinterested aesthetic reception. Needless to say, I was forcibly struck by what he says here. As with any large social and cultural development, many factors conspired to bring about the changes to the way Europeans understood art. M.H. Abrams explains the increasing prominence of disinterested attention to works of the arts as a byproduct of the rise of connoisseurship and the passion for collections of all sorts that gripped the middle class. But in his book, James Simpson, Under the Hammer, well, here's my topic, offers a very different explanation of the emergence of what he calls the Age of Art. It's what Hans Belting calls the Age of Art. He argues that it represented the resolution by Europeans of a type of social conflict present in many societies that had become particularly virulent in England in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. It complements rather than contradicts Abraham's account. Well, as you can imagine, my ponderings were over. I'd be talking about what Mike Abrams presents in his essay, Art as Such, the Sociology of Modern Aesthetics. Abrams magisterially describes the genesis of a new European posture to art, and not exclusively visual art, in the 18th century, a posture whereby art was to be contemplated with disinterest, regarded for its own sake, without regard to the personal interests or the possessiveness or the desires of the perceiver, and without reference to its truth or its utility or its morality. Well, I wholly agree with Abrams' learned and decisive description of this astonishing phenomenon. whose mighty after effects continue one way or another to condition our own treatment of art as such. Wolterstorff is entirely correct in saying that Abraham's position and mine are complementary, since Abraham's account is descriptive and mine causal. That causal argument runs as follows. Aesthetics is a solution to the iconoclastic fury that had agonized Northern Europe across the 16th and 17th centuries. I cite from my Under the Hammer, the cool detachments of enlightened taste within the larger field of aesthetics is shaped as a concessive Enlightenment response to evangelical critiques of the image. Taste is a product of a Western Europe whose artistic tradition had been profoundly fractured by theological difference. Taste, with its focus on form, is a strategy designed to reunify that artistic tradition at least. Focus on the form, ignore the content, experience freedom, even as you look at art, and religious art in particular. The category of the aesthetic is itself in sum a historical product of iconoclasm. So there is no necessary disagreement between my position and that of Abrams. We're making different kinds of argument. But there is, however, a very different marked temperature difference between the two accounts. For Abrams, disinterested appreciation of art is cool. It's about the free experience of aesthetic pleasure, the pleasure of touch or taste, both of which, when you think about it, require low temperatures. My argument has it that this cool posture of aesthetic sprezzatura is explicable as an advertisement of freedom in the face of a terrifying alternative. Iconoclasts had been hammering away at that terrifying alternative for the previous 150 years. They'd been hammering away at religious images, that is, under the persuasion that the images were out to enslave us through idolatry. Behind the cool taste of the connoisseur lies a history of fiery distaste. Behind the cool, then, the hot. I have, as I say, made the broad causal argument for this temperature drop in Under the Hammer. But today I focus on the moment of transition itself, from hot to cool, from iconoclasm to aesthetics. The dramatic temperature change around the image produces, or so I'll argue, painful stresses and strains, not to say cracks, within the fabric of the early modern image, whether secular or religious, whether visual or verbal. The standard story has it that disinterested aesthetic appreciation begins in the 18th century. Here, I'll argue that the temperature change starts well before then, in the 17th century. Being an early modern self, deprived of the sacred image, hurts. The ensuing pain is expressed in a new kind of image, painfully conscious of its aesthetic status. So I begin with a very simple contrast between the status of the religious image in the later medieval period and its suddenly revised status in England in the 1530s. The Decalogue, to be sure, prohibited the making of any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth. Pre-Reformation Christianity, however, alone amongst the Abrahamic religions, did nevertheless justify the image with greater or lesser theological force. And it did so especially from the rhetorical and educative defense of images as books for the unlettered. It was Pope Gregory I, who made this defence in the early 7th century. Now, this is a very large and reasonably well-known story. The high point of its artistic expression is the mighty visual movement of devotional piety between the later 12th and 15th centuries. That story is not today's topic. We focus instead on the end of that movement, the early modern moment when images were proscribed from penitential intercession. Visual representation plays an indispensable role in at least two ways within the late medieval sacrament of penance. The word representation has at least two main senses. Sense one is artifactual. A made image is a representation insofar as it makes its referent present again. Sense two concerns mediation and intercession, just as our congressman makes representation for and of us to a higher authority. So too did a pre-Reformation saint make representation to God on behalf of an individual Christian. The pre-Reformation Christian used artifactual representations of the saint as the focus of intercessory prayers, i.e. representations, to higher powers. Consider the way representation in both senses, image or artifact, and intercession, act of intercession. Consider the way representation in both senses just mentioned operates in this image. Abbot Hont reads a book in his private study on the right panel. On the left, we see the Virgin as intercessor, which is what Abbot Hont is seeing as a mental image through his reading. We're seeing into Abbot Hont's psyche. The visual regime of the right-hand panel is governed wholly by metonymy, or habitual association, in a realistic representation of a private study, whereas the left-hand panel is ruled by metaphor. The mental image of the Virgin is a metaphor for the Church itself, and so dominates its space. The action signified by the metonymic image on the right brings the kind of metaphorical image on the left to sudden, vibrant, imaginary life. So too within the space of the late medieval church depicted on the left, there are many other images designed to enable the same imaginative and intercessory work. The stained glass windows, the rood screen carvings, the little statue of Virgin and Child just on the right-hand side of the Virgin's shoulder. Back within the abbot's study, the double-panelled portable image, this one here, this double-panelled portable image serves as a mise en abîme of the entire portable image we see, quietly bringing the entire psychic event of intercession to visualize vibrant life. The function of the represented images within the image are powerful justifications for the image we behold. One kind of representation, the artifact, is authorized by another kind of representation, the Virgin, the Church's intercession, via a third kind of image, which is the psychic imagination, itself an image, of the Virgin that we see in the abbot's mind, psyche. The image serves as both artifactual representation and as functional penitential representer of the abbot to God via the church. It represents in two dynamic ways. In his magisterial 1990 Likeness and Presence, the history of the image before the era of art, Hans Belting made sense of images of this kind, where the artefact is functional, designed to trigger a transactional act of intercession. Belting not only opens up a fundamental distinction between the image and its different intercessory functions, but he also defines the period when the distinction between image and its function was made without embarrassment, before what he calls the era of art, what Abrams calls the period of art as such, which is primarily, fundamentally, the 18th century. With that distinction, Belting nourished between image and its function. Belting nourished the field of art history with what we might call an anthropological account of image and icon, its transactional function within a broad set of intercessory practices, such as, say, city defence or personal salvation. So there are two fundamental theological persuasions undergirding this conception of the image as representation. First of all, that the image can aid in the transmission of intercessory prayers. And secondly, that the works of penitence exercised with a measure of free will might legitimately include such prayers. Both these theological convictions, however, were proscribed in England from the late 1530s in legislation and episcopal ordinance, and those legislative acts lasted for more than a century. So I start with the legal materials targeting the religious image. England experienced more than a century of legislated iconoclasm of every single religious image from 1538 to 1643 and a bit beyond. This project of state-driven iconoclasm was longer, more centralised, more systematically legislated than anywhere else in Reformation Europe. The first stage of the legislative story begins in 1538, when all visible cult of the saints before their images was forbidden. Archbishop Cranmer instructed bishops that all images that are abused with images or offerings, ye shall, for the avoiding of that most detestable sin of idolatry, forthwith take down and destroy. Deciding, however, which image was subject to idolatry required X-ray vision. It was really quite a tricky matter, working out which was being abused, which image, and which not. So Cranmer rewrote the legislation in 1547. He simplified it. In 1547, he said, is contention for images, whether they have been, in almost every place, says Cranmer in 1547, is contention for images, whether they have been abused or not. And so he therefore produces a further, more sweeping and simpler solution. All the images remaining in any church or chapel shall be removed and taken away. Versions of this draconian legislation were repeated in 1550 under Edward VI, 1559 under Elizabeth. And this 1538, 1559 legislation held until the much, much more fierce iconoclastic Civil War legislation of 1643, requiring destruction of all images in churches again, but extending the demand for visual purification to all religious images in any open place within this kingdom. That legislation, I add, also demanded that all the musical instruments in churches be destroyed. Thus, one form of representation, the artefactual, these images, the images, were to be destroyed, each and every one of them. What, though, of the second intercessory form of representation? The destruction of the physical images is now, thanks to the great lamented Margaret Aston, a very well-known story. the prohibition on the image's representation in the intercessory sense is less well known as applied to images. Penitential representation or intercession is premised on the idea that humans, through their free will, can negotiate with God on the basis of deservings accrued by salutary works. The Lutheran and then the Calvinist insistence on grace or gift as the sole source of salvation is, however, a dismissal of that free will. And as such, it is equally a dismissal of the possibility of intercessory negotiation, of representation. The initiative for salvation now lies wholly with the inscrutable absolutist, early modern God. Negotiation or intercession for representation of the individual Christian becomes an act of idolatrous effrontery in a Calvinist regime. By 1563, the entire sacramental apparatus of penitence, including intercessory prayers, had been formally proscribed and replaced by the doctrine of predestination, which is Article 17 of the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, which lasted until 1828. And so between at least 1563 and 1660, again more than a century, the English state legislated against confidence in free will and its works, including intercessory prayers. I always find myself wanting to read that passage again. It takes a bit of absorption. Between at least 1563 and 1660, the English state legislated against free will and its works, including intercessory prayers. So in sum, both the forms of representation we can see in the Abbot Hont image were targets of official injunction from the 1530s. The images were to be destroyed, and the intercessions they effected were to be prohibited. They were prohibited. Both the image and the intercession it enabled were dismissed as idolatrous. Fierce repudiation of the theology behind these representational or mediating practices, both artifactual and intercessory, must afflict the Christian sense of self, now bereft of salutary representation via images in the court of heaven. In a moment, we look both to a searing poetic example of that afflicted self, deprived of the intercessory image. We also look to the correlative emergence of the pained aesthetic artifact, both visual and poetic. But first, however, we should step back and consider the broader picture of Calvin's theological account of licit artistic representation under an iconoclastic regime. Calvin's position on images is notoriously hostile. It produced those utterly whitewashed churches of the kind that Zwingli described as beautiful, divend sind hübsche Wiss. These white walls are just so beautiful, says Zurich-based Zwingli. Calvin locates idolatry deep within the human psyche, describing that psyche as a factory of idols. Destroying all the images is, however, too tall an order, even for Calvin. And so his solution is to limit the power of images in two ways. One must only paint things that could have been perceptible to the eye, and secondly, one must restrict oneself to licit subjects. Those licit subjects are, respectively, histories that teach and images and fashions of bodies without expressing any of the things done by them. It's a bit opaque, that. The second set of licit subjects, by which Calvin seems to designate portraiture, still life and landscape, is designed only to give pleasure, praeter oblectationem in the Latin institutions, 1536. It has no other, this representation of portraiture, still life and landscape, it has no other didactic or any other function. It's only for pleasure. In the 1545 vernacular edition of Calvin's Institutes, French edition, the worthlessness of these subjects is underlined. Calvin is explicit about what genres of painting he has in mind and what value he attaches to them. After specifying history painting, he goes on. En la seconde, les arbres, montagnes, rivières et personnages qu'on peint sans aucune signification. Things that mean absolutely nothing. Trees, mountains, rivers, personnages. Sans aucune signification. Here we see with remarkable clarity the future directions in early modern Northern European painting. Calvin gives enormous impulse to portraiture, still life, and landscape, things that are without any meaning. These images were art designed to give pleasure, not intercessory representations. These were, I need not add, the major new genres of early modern Northern European painting. What we had taken as the new visual culture of the secular image is in fact in silent, vibrant dialogue with a repressed religious visual culture. The cost of that new visual culture was that, in Calvin's words, it should mean nothing, or in the slightly less disparaging terms of ecclesiological theory, it should be spiritually indifferent. It should be an adiaphora. So, in the light of these new doctrines about the image and salvation, in the light of the prohibition of the image as representation in both sense, how does it feel to be a self? In addressing this question, we move into the psyche to observe, the early modern psyche, to observe the intense pressures placed on the self by the abolition of images that make representations. We look to the self, newly subject to iconoclastic self-harm. In my next and final section, I turn to the pained aesthetic representation of that non-representable psyche. But let's look to the psyche itself, the early modern psyche, and just consider, reflect, observe what it feels like to be deprived of images. It hurts. From the beginning of iconoclasm in England, image destruction was to be painful. No pain, no gain. That's the message from Strasbourg as sent by Martin Bucer to English evangelicals in 1535. Bucer's is the first iconoclastic treatise arriving in England. It recognised, just 3 years before the actual legislation, Bucer's treatise recognises that hard handling is going to be necessary. Images must not be attacked softly and so tenderly handled in the manner of weak-minded men who, with a foolish imagination, are wont to have compassion and to sorrow somewhat when they, the images, are broken. These would-be fake iconoclasts are moved to pity because the images resemble suffering humans, as though with the figure and similitude of man, they also had man's wits and reasons. The breaking must accordingly be official and pitiless, must work according to the dictates of Scripture, we ought to break them. Yea, and that all to powder, that they might never be made whole again, nor restored into so wicked an abuse. The principle of no pain, no gain acquired extra traction in the second phase of the English Reformation, when it became clear that the job of iconoclasm can never be done. Iconoclasm of physical images is always on the lookout for another hit. It can never be a single act. Iconoclasm is instead a dynamic process, precisely because the iconoclast thinks idolatry is an addictive habit, impossible to kick. The writer of the official 1563 sermon and homily against the peril of idolatry, one of these sermons had to be read by legislation in every single parish church throughout England, 36,000 of them. And so the homily on the perils of idolatry, which was added to the homilies in 1563, this homily betrays a certain despair at the sheer difficulty of eradicating idolatry. For, the author acknowledges, echoing Calvin, idolatry standeth chiefly in the mind. Mankind is exceeding prone to idolatry. As few as are inclined to credit sound doctrine, as many and almost all are prone to superstition and idolatry. So that herein appeareth not only a difficulty, but also an impossibility of the remedy. The main psychological characteristic of iconoclasts, I should add, is always exhaustion. They're always just utterly defeated by the fact that there's yet more images. More of them have shot up. We've defined other things as images. The job is never done. It's hard work. So physical destruction had now to extend to a new front of aggression against the image. But this time, in what I'm calling the second phase of iconoclasm, this time it had to move into the psyche itself. The first phase of iconoclasm in England is kind of carnivalesque. It's great fun walking around a church with a hammer in your hand. But when you're being told that you've got to move into your own psyche with your own psychic hammer, then it's much, much less fun. The hammer-wielding iconoclast needed, above all, to move into and through his or her own psyche, there to lay waste to the imagination. So in this second phase of iconoclasm, from the 1560s forwards, the carnivalesque quality of the first phase gives way to a glum necessity of self-harm. Destructive joy turns to melancholy. Calvin's successor, Theodore Beza, claimed to have been successful in purifying his own psyche. I had driven the crucifix from my mind, he claimed, but weaker brethren clearly required more strenuous direction. As Lawrence Humphrey wrote from his Marian exile in Basel in 1559, if the idols are removed from the churches but steal into the mind and statues are erected in the heart, that is deformation, not reformation, a change of place, not a driving away of the thing, and so much the more dangerous because it is interior and personal. Self-harm is perceptible in English poetry of the second melancholy phase of iconoclasm. Poetry uses images. This platitude has not yet awoken from its somnolent status as dull pedagogic truism with regard to early modern English poetry. And this is a lost opportunity, since poetry is also the prime place we look in order to understand the contours of the self in any given period, the contours of subjectivity. Early modern Protestant poetry is certainly rich in images and also rich as a site for understanding early modern selfhood. So we turn then to the intimate relationship between the destruction of the image in the self, or better, damage to the self as itself an idolatrous image. Though far from being a Puritan, the underrated, brilliant Fulk Greville promotes internal iconoclasm more unsparingly than any iconoclast. Greville's astonishing and, for the most part, unrecognised lyric sequence, Kailika, written variously between 1577 and 1628, begins with love lyrics, but it changes at number 88 to religious lyrics. And the most penetrating of these religious lyrics, number 100 in the sequence, is a sonnet that confronts the terrible challenge, the desolating melancholy of inner psychic iconoclasm. It takes us into the dark recesses of the imageless psyche. Let's read it. In night, when all colours, all to black, are cast, distinction lost or gone down with the light, the eye a watch to inward senses placed, not seeing, yet still having power of sight, gives vain alarums to the inward sense, where fear stirred up with witty tyranny confounds all powers, and through self-offence doth forge and raise impossibility, such as in thick depriving darknesses proper reflections of the error be, and images of self-confusednesses which hurt imaginations only see. And from this nothing seen tells news of devils which but expressions be of inward evils. Greville imagines the psyche of a site of wholly invisible darkness in which no image can be seen, in night when colours all to black are cast, distinction lost or gone down with the light. This imageless space turns out, however, to be terrifying. The inner eye, always on the lookout, gives vain alarums to the inward sense. And that inner eye, the imagination, will never cease producing images. But in this imageless space of heightened surveillance, which has already been subject to iconoclastic purification, the imagination, by an act of self-offence, continues to produce only images, never stops producing them, of self-confusednesses which hurt imaginations only see. And from this nothing seen, the imagination tells news of devils, which but expressions be of inward evils. The obedient iconoclast tries, the good Calvinist tries to purify the psyche of images, but this act of self-offence only ends up with other images, more painful images, images of self-confusion. So in the wake of iconoclasm, then, we find self-harm. If selves hurt, though, what of the surviving images expressing that disabled self? Do the images hurt too? Do they express the pain of entering the disenchanted world of aesthetics, the world of non-representing, perhaps non-representative artifacts, images sans aucune signification? Well, yes, is the answer to that question. Or so 17th century Netherlandish paintings tell us. As a new form of aesthetic autonomy took shape in Northern European painting in the 16th century, it's no accident that it should have expressed itself so powerfully through still life. We're unable to narrate the history of the genre of still life in England, since the artistic tradition was so aggressively interrupted there by the rigorous legislated iconoclasm between 1538 and 1643, to which I earlier referred. If this were an art historical talk, then we would turn to Dutch images of this kind. In response to this image, we cannot help but ask whether or not it has sacramental resonance. Yes, well, there's bread, there's wine, there's flesh, there's a chalice, there's a table, a kind of altar, if you will, a meal. Oh, no, this is not sacramental. The chalice is overturned. This is a messy after-breakfast table. This is a banal image of a banal moment. The work of art brilliantly represents a material world, really brilliantly, I think you'll agree, but equally underlines the limits of its work, the work of art. Those new limits to art's work mark the new territory of disenchantment. Fear not, Calvin, this is not sacramental. It has no significance. Art does no transactional work here. It does the work of art instead, praeter oblectationem, just for pleasure. Those disenchanted limits mark a new, cool discourse, as cool as the mess after breakfast, that of art as such coming into view. But it's a coolness, I think you'll agree, edged by melancholy. But this, however, is not an art historical talk. I'm not competent to deliver such a talk. It's primarily a literary talk. So let us end there by turning to just one of many possible lyrics by George Herbert from his sequence The Temple, published posthumously in 1633. Of all 17th century religious poets, Herbert is the most committed to a Laudian aesthetic of decorous outward observance, of beautiful design, of spatial neatness. He's committed to the very layout and furniture of the church being persuasively expressive of human address to the divine, a fine aspect of fit array. The tripartite design of Herbert's collection, The Temple, itself expresses a commitment to the synergy of form and function, divided as that design is into three sequences. First of all, poems at the church porch, teaching ethics and decorum. Secondly, poems from within the church itself, called The Church, expressing Herbert's passionate, deeply personal relationship to God. And thirdly, a poem in heroic couplets devoted to the church militant in the world beyond the church, so standing outside the church, being in the church, moving out from the church. Each sequence has its characteristic functions and metrical forms. Each is built by design principles set to different purposes. Design and the making of both parts and whole in some declare the human maker's skill and the human maker's confidence in the expressive sacramental power of the beautifully designed religious artifact. That said, once inside the church, sequence 2, decorum fragments. Being in the church is for Herbert a solitary, not a collective or rarely a liturgical experience. That private space gives license for Herbert's intimate expression of a much more intense, agonised, and, it might be said, Calvinist spirituality. Calvinist predestination's insistence on crushing all human initiative. The effrontery of making intercessory address to God. The sheer incommensurability of divine and human scale. The unbridgeable distance and the shuddering unendurable silence of the Calvinist Deus absconditus, the hidden God of Calvinist and Lutheran spirituality, the intense solitude of the racked Calvinist, imploring yet not daring to implore God, because to implore would be transactional. All these theological convictions exert terrible pressure on Herbert's lyrics, taking him much closer to the exacting, singular, emotional extremities of early modern Calvinist subjectivity. These pressures reveal a second Herbert, not the quietly confident lover of sacramental design and achieved form, but a broken voice of spiritual agony. Within this second sequence, the Church, those angular Calvinist pressures also break confidence in the most ambitious project of ecclesiastical design to give visible, palpable, effective shape to intercessory cultic forms. That's what sacraments are all about. Calvinism posits an absolutely transcendent God in whom resides all spiritual initiative. Calvinist soteriology, theory of salvation, therefore beggars human confidence in both design and intercession. We can see many of these issues, and especially issues of the impossibility of representation in both senses, play out, or certainly in the intercessory sense, play out in Herbert's poem, The Altar, the first of the poems from within the sequence, The Church. So the sequence begins then by verbally crafting the centerpiece of church furniture, the church interior, the place of sacrifice, the altar. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hand did frame, no workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart alone is such a stone, and nothing but thy power doth cut. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name. That if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. O let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. Herbert starts building the church with its principal sacramental artifact, the altar, but no sooner has the work begun than it's undone. The poem is driven by a double contradictory impulse. On the one hand, verbally to build what had been the artifact par excellence of representation, the altar, where Christ's real presence was represented, and on the other, to neutralise that artifact's function. We participate in the verbal construction, line by lapidary line. But even as we do so, we're painfully aware of watching the construction of a deeply flawed, broken artifact, multiply incapable of representation. The most obvious way in which for Herbert the altar was no longer the site of functional representation was the abolition, since 1552, of the Eucharistic doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharistic host. In the words of the official 39 Articles, again, ratified in 1571, transubstantiation, the real presence, hath given occasion to many superstitions. Henceforth, the Eucharist was a memorial event, making no claim to representation in the intercessory sense, and no claim to representation in the sense of making present again. Herbert's allegorization and abstraction of church furniture is, under the aegis of Calvinism, designed to save it. The truest altar is the altar of the human heart, not at all the material thing which needs to be discursively broken, at least allegorized. Herbert sets about building that true allegorized altar, and we accompany his construction, line by stony line. What, however, suddenly confronts us after the conceptual breaking of the material image, none other than an image, a material image, in the form of concrete poetry. We're suddenly shaken out of looking through the poem to looking at the poem. The poem that deploys the machinery of allegory to rise above the limitations of the physical altar ends up producing another physical construction, a made image. The poem concedes the inevitability and necessity of material images. And the image so produced activates a drama of workmanship, declaring initially that the maker of its parts was divine. No workman's tool hath touched the parts of this new-made altar. So this is supposedly what Byzantine theorists called an archairo-poetic image, an image made without human hand. The human maker is nonetheless involved in the process of making those human... Thy servant rears the separate stones, and that same servant, the poet, must work on and in the quarry of his own hard heart to prepare the altar stones. The obdurate, stony hardness of the altar's parts are paradoxically hard and serviceable only by being cuttable, and it's only the poet who can render his own hard heart more cuttable, i.e. softer, for the hard parts to fit together. It's very paradoxical. Even as Herbert disowns his own work as stonecutter, even as he proclaims God as the only one having power to cut this stony heart, he recognises his own participation in the work of cutting the stony heart. A human hand is, after all, involved, and it's Herbert's hand. In fact, the human maker cannot help but reveal his making hand at every turn. The symmetrical pattern of metrical stresses betrays the human hand at its work of construction, laying each line as a separate stone, one by carefully laid one, drawing attention to each as it slots deliberately into place. A heart alone is such a stone. The function of the image, its power to make representation, is also dependent on the human maker. If I chance to hold my peace, the base of the altar. By the way, there's a typo there. That it should be if, it reads it. I think it's very appropriate that the original edition has a mistake. It's very much a human artifact. If I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. The poem to date emphasises only the premeditated deliberation of the mason at work, whether that mason be God or the poet. There's been no chance involved whatsoever. The verbal altar will only praise God paradoxically when the poet stops working and waits upon divine grace, when the poet stops making. In the meanwhile, we have not a divine but human voice, the voice of a poetic craftsman. The object we observe is clearly of his making. As such, the constructed object is unsanctified, a human construction awaiting the real future sacrifice. And that sacrifice is surprisingly not Christ's, as Orthodox Eucharistic theology would have it, but rather the poet's, through the softening of his heart. The altar in some will work as sanctified altar only when the poet himself stops making, only when the poet softens his own heart towards God. In the meanwhile, we have a draft, a model, an improvised, unsanctified human construction, awaiting dissolution through softening and silence in the future, when it will really work, when it disappears. Herbert's devotional poetry frequently employs subjunctives, if, and injunctives, let. The utterance of the poem is not happening in its here and now. The poem is but preparation and practice. It's a human product, unsanctified, a construction. In this case, an evidently and obdurately human image. Only when Herbert stops work will the altar be sanctified and able to praise. Only then will it be able to acknowledge, through the poet's own imitative sacrifice, its maker. Only then will he sanctify this altar to be thine. But that's in the future. For the moment, in the here and now of the poem, we have an unsanctified human product, not God's, but Herbert's. We have what we might call an aesthetic artifact, painfully looking beyond itself to an unlikely future when it will be transformed. In sum, the aesthetic is taking place, taking shape in the first third of the 17th century. It does so by manifesting both hot iconoclastic and cool aesthetic tendencies in the same tortured, broken artifact. It does so by seeking out spaces of asylum from the iconoclast's hideous hammer. Abrams' art as such is visible here as a future possibility. But it comes into visibility, to be sure, by bidding melancholy farewell to multiple forms of representation. It's the relic of representation, a left object, relic in that sense, left behind, testifying to the failure of intercession. But in our larger history, the melancholy, in my view, is balanced by the unmelancholy, perhaps joyful fact that thanks to the aesthetic, we can, thank heavens, all connect with this text, regardless of our religion or lack of it. Thank you very much for listening so attentively. Thank you. There's a question here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm enjoying your beautiful reading, which I've really, really loved of the altar, and your whole talk. But I'm stuck with something, and I'm hoping to help me figure it out, which is in the quotation that you read from Husserl about differentiating the image from a person, right? The need to differentiate the image from something that really has wit and reason, right? It seemed like Husserl's making this point of the...
Husserl?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, yes. Yes, I got it, yeah, I heard it, yeah.
But in your reading of the Herbert, it almost seems to me as though you're suggesting that there is an awareness of the human as an image, right? The image of God, right? The person is made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And almost an internalization of the image in the human subject, as opposed to this differentiation. So that was something that struck me, and I want to know if you would correct it, or if you see that happening.
Yeah. Well, I think, thank you for this question. I think you're pointing out something that the iconoclasts seem to have failed to observe, which is that in Genesis 1:11, I think, we're told that God made humankind ad similitudinem eius, according to his own image, so that Christians are always going to find this distinction between the image and the human a difficult one to act upon if they only want to break images, because they're going to end up having to break themselves. In fact, that's precisely my argument. They do end up breaking themselves. They end up practicing a kind of self-harm. So what you pointed to is a counter-theological perception built deep into the Hebrew Scriptures, which actually justifies the image, which is a profound defense of the image. God made images himself, and they're called humans. Masha.
I feel like this is a follow-up to Raina's question in a way, but maybe not. And really, if art is the solution to centuries of conflict over images,
Mm-hmm.
and if that solution becomes rendering art non-intercessory and non-effective and merely an object of pleasure,
Let me stop you there, Masha.
merely...
I'm so relieved. My lecture has been transmitted. You understand the full thing.
So-
Thank you already. Sorry, go on.
Are you making fun of me? I'm serious.
No, I'm not.
I just want to say,
On the contrary.
does all of this explain a mere few centuries later the death of the humanities, so-called? Meaning, is this gesture towards the merely pleasurable art as no longer addressing God in a transactional manner? Is this actually why we're having trouble filling our English classes?
Thus speaks the Director of Undergraduate Studies.
That was completely that question, yes.
Yeah. This is a huge question,
Well-
which I don't have a ready answer to.
Because we also have the denigration of pleasure as part of all of this, right? There's a real fearfulness of pleasure built into the denigration of the image. Something you didn't talk about as much, but that I think might need to be added here.
Yeah.
So art is merely pleasure, merely is merely. Maybe you don't have to take literature classes, or art history classes, or come to lectures for that matter.
Yeah. So now
I'm
there
very
are
angry about this, in case you can't tell.
now there are two questions. One is the conflicted place of pleasure in our discipline, and the other is the perhaps dangerous place of pleasure, because if it's only pleasure, then hey, there are serious things happening out there in that world, and why should we be amusing ourselves with the pleasurable? Let me take the second one first. These are huge questions. Everyone in this room will have substantial answers to Masha's powerful questions. But I'll just answer each one very quickly. The second one first, the danger of pleasure. I think in my own scholarship, I'm really interested in looking at functionality, looking at how images really work in the world. So I do not follow a Kantian injunction to look at the form and forget the content. I'm interested in the dynamic relationship of form and content, and therefore of aesthetic function in the real world, in what Belting might call the anthropological function of artifacts. But that having been said, I think we should be careful of just throwing out the aesthetic, throwing out the museum. We can be critical. I am critical, or saying making critique-sounding claims about the museum, about even new criticism, certainly about that. But we should be aware of the affordances of the aesthetic as well. And it was to those that I alluded in my very last sentence, because all our universities now, except the Christian ones, are for everybody, regardless of creed. And so we can't be ideologically party-free with our aesthetic objects. And aesthetics gives us a kind of neutral territory. The museum gives us a space in which all these conflicting artifacts from conflicting traditions, which secretly we might want to commit ourselves to, but in public we will not commit ourselves to. In public we will regard as artifacts, as aesthetic artifacts, and talk about them in aesthetic ways. So, you know, there's revolution, there's convulsion behind all these works of art. You know, it's a very violent history. We don't want to go back there again. So, you know, I think we should be careful of just throwing out the category of aesthetic, even as we are aware of its limitations. As to the conflicted place of pleasure in our discipline, this is a complex story, but I just can't help thinking that it's Calvinism at its characteristic work. You know, it's got to hurt. You think this is pleasurable? You think reading Wordsworth is fun? You love it? It's delightful? Well, think again. You know, read the whole of the prelude and read the second version as well. You know, you're slacking off. You're not working hard enough. So, you know, we're all, no, I shouldn't say we're all Calvinists. I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room who are not Calvinists. But one way or another, we're all afflicted by Calvinist pathologies. Merit.
I think this is definitely an off-piste question.
Mm.
I'm looking at that image and looking at those ripples along the whatever it's on, of cloth, carved cloth. And I was thinking about the images of the prelate matched by the Virgin, and the two things are balanced very carefully by their trains. One, there's a cloth of his habit and her dress. And then, which are kind of meaningless, but they're exercises of the artist's hand. Okay, they're just there. And then I was thinking about the still life, where you have all these objects, and one you didn't name was a cloth, which is sort of pure skill in drapery. And of course it's a weave. And then I was thinking about your wonderful ending with the last instance, which was the poem by Herbert, in which you drew attention to these oddities of the construction of the weave, as it were, of the metrics, and the perfectly excessive nature of that weave as something that was purely the hand of the poet, as it were. So my question is, in a way, what do you do with this, let's call it the hand of the artist, and the materiality in which it is manifested, in ways that may be in the service of an image or not, but they are also manifestations of the act of making within different medias. Okay, so that's my off-piste question.
Yeah, well, the only thing I disagree with you is being off-piste. I don't think it is off-piste at all, because it's all about making, isn't it? You know, the aesthetic is about being aware of a humanly made artifact, a constructed object. We can't think aesthetically unless we think thus. So in the Herbert poem, I think our awareness of the humanness of the constructed quality of the altar, I totally agree with how you put it, I think that really fits with the Herbert, fits with the argument, he says self-interestedly, that this is a human-made artifact where the workman's hand can be seen. And insofar as it is that, it is running counter to that huge artistic tradition before the age of art, the Byzantine tradition of the icon, as the icon being made without human hand. These images just were divinely produced. So I don't have any problem with Herbert's, the visibility of the human hand, the human maker's hand in Herbert's Old, because in a way that's what the poem was about. But your brilliant perception here of these kind of symmetrical flows of cloth, which I had not thought about, really kind of noticed at all, seems to be more of a problem, because in this image everything is supposed to be the human artifacts, all of them, and there are many of them, there are dozens, but they're just brilliant with humanly made artifacts. They're all nonetheless resonant, symbolically pointing beyond themselves. Whether or not, like, I would know how to say that the cloths are pointing beyond themselves. They seem most obviously to be pointing to the fact that this image was made in Bruges, and that Bruges and the rest of the Low Countries were great cloth-making centres, and they're advertising their wares. The only other thing I'll say about that is that I think a lot of recent scholarship, notably by Simon Sharma, has emphasised the materiality of this visual culture, particularly in the 17th century. But I think it's emphasising it in a kind of relentless way, which is cutting out the kind of resonance, the spiritual resonance of these still lives. But here I think you've pointed to a problem. These cloths are definitely human-made. They're spectacular. When you think about it, they're kind of crucial to the architecture of the entire binary image. I personally wouldn't know how to say they have symbolic, spiritual significance.
Well, you're taking it as a representation of cloth, but it's actually what it is paint.
Oh, that too. Yeah. Yeah, but this painting doesn't want you to think about that. Well, does it? Because this side, by the way, is a straight reproduction of an image, the whole thing. Because Van Eyck, in 1436, a good 50 years before this image, 50, 60 years, paints this image. It's an image. So there's another layer in which this painting is about and celebrating symbolic images, because it is itself an artifact based on a prior artifact. Van Eyck's is exactly the same. It's millimetre for millimetre, identical. So it is conscious and evidently advertising its commitment to craftedness. But it's doing so only in a way now I'm just repeating my thesis, but you've made me slightly doubt my thesis. It's doing so only in a way as to suggest that the image intersects. The image has a function of representing us, making representations for us to higher powers. So I think you've spotted a problem for me.
Sorry.
Yeah, Jessica.
Thank you, Jesus. I'm wondering about ornament, following partially but more pedestrian than the last question, and about ornament, especially in these periods, as something that was often associated with something non-representational. And I'm thinking in particular of the history of the arabesque and its movement sort of from the Mediterranean starting in the 15th century west, and the arabesque and ornament and vignette and foliage and all of that. in domestic architecture, in print, and it has me thinking more about the prohibition against graven images and the degree to which that was also and would increasingly, partially through a sort of caricature of Islam, would be associated with the East. So I'm wondering about the status of that prohibition and its association with Islam rather than with the Reformation too, and the force of that. But I'm also wondering how that might intersect with a history of ornament as something useless, excessive, potentially opposed to art and history aesthetics, where art and ornament eventually split on the, in terms of function, class, etc.
I think the history of ornament really, in part, takes off from this moment, because ornaments all of a sudden become really important. And even in the homily on the perils of idolatry, the author takes time off to say, well, roses and flowers and things, they're okay, surely. No one's going to fuss about them. So ornaments are coming into focus as a licit image. There's a recent book that I haven't read I just started to read it, by Tara Hambling about interior decoration of English homes in late Elizabethan England. And I think she's saying, it just shows that English people weren't against images at all, and that images were perfectly okay, even religious images. But what she doesn't seem to notice is that all those ornaments are still conforming with Calvin's strictures on licit images. So I think the ornament myself becomes really important at this moment, precisely because it's saying, it doesn't mean anything. It's just for pleasure. As soon as you say that, then you start looking at ornaments really closely. All those still life paintings, full of ornament, and full of kind of resonance. Try and prohibit the human psyche from doing something, and there's only one thing you can be sure of, that the human psyche will immediately go ahead and do it. And so too with ornaments, But I think this moment is very important for the history of ornamentation. Oh, Corbin.
Hello. So, thank you. I wanted to know, so when we do away with our books from the unlearned and our didactic images, how do we fill that gap? Because the unlettered don't go away.
Yeah, they need to get reading. They need to go to school and learn to read scripture really, really quickly. So I think the basic cultural presumption of these texts is about verbal education, so that the unlettered will go away. But of course that too is a massive job in 16th and 17th century England. But Calvin is saying that certain kinds of religious painting will be okay if it's just historical, if it's just about teaching. If it's not making any intercessory functional claim, except in transmitting knowledge about Scripture. So the unlearned are being catered for, if you will. They're being thought about a lot, even if there's a whole lot of terrifying anxiety about what these unlearned actually think. The whole discourse of iconoclasm in the 16th and 17th century, which is vast, is really a discourse in good part, not only about the primacy of Scripture, but also about what actually happens in an unlearned person's head.
Thank you.
Maybe one more Question?
Oh, there was a question here, yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the role of figural poetry, the literal Carmen figurata, or figuratum, the figuratum, excuse me, the poem that is in the image of the object that it's describing. And that 5-4-2-4-5, on a poem about an altar would appear to be itself a kind of figural, depiction of the very object, which then itself becomes symbolic of the human, make yourself a sacrifice unto God, etc. So I wonder about, if you're thinking about the role of figura and you're thinking about the role of Carmina, what of the role of figural poems themselves within this space as a kind of juxtaposition, deliberate sort of mashup of this textual and imagistic forms of observation?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about this broadly, but I guess one could just start generating the same kinds of distinctions that I've been making in the talk. And think, for example, of the Divine Comedy, which is numerically all to do with threes. Every stanza is a terzina. There are 33 cantos in each of the cantica of the Divine Comedy. It's all very figural. You can look at it and it looks like the Trinity. But it looks like the Trinity. It's just because it's made and evidently made doesn't mean that it doesn't resonate more broadly. But with the concrete poem, I'm arguing that this is looking very much like the human hand having made something. Yeah. We need more examples of the figured poem. Yeah.
I think we should allow James a chance to recover. We can go upstairs and have refreshments at the reception in the English lounge. And thank him again for this.
Thank you.